Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Korea Defense Veterans Association's webinar on the United Nations Command. I am Colonel Retired Steve Lee, the Senior Vice President of KDVA. Before I introduce our moderator, Lieutenant General Retired J.D. Johnson, I'll very briefly cover the agenda. After remarks from General Johnson, Colonel Shawn Creamer will provide an introduction on the history and current relationship of UNC to other important organizations in Korea. Then General Johnson will lead a moderated discussion with our two speakers, General Scaparrotti and General Brooks, and then open the floor for Q&A with our audience members. You can submit questions at any time using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. You can do this even before the Q&A session starts. Please keep the questions relevant to our discussion and short, no more than 1 to 3 sentences. Please remember to direct your questions to a specific panel member. This webinar will be available on the KDVA.vet digital library and the KDVA YouTube channel in a day or two. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce our moderator. Lieutenant General Retired J.D. Johnson was the 3-star commander of the U.S. 8th Army in Korea from November 2010 to June 2013. He also served on the Joint Staff, the Army Staff, and the U.S. Army Installation Management Command, and in several combined and joint assignments in Germany, Korea, and Iraq. General Johnson culminated his career as a director of the Joint Improvised Explosive Device Defeat Organization in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. He is currently Vice President of U.S. Business Development for Army and Special Operations Forces programs at Raytheon. He is a member of the KDVA Board of Directors. General Johnson has a reputation for being very hardworking, humble, and an inspirational leader. I worked for him in the Pentagon and in Korea, and that characterization is well deserved. He might not like my saying this, but my embassy colleagues in Seoul used to marvel at how early he would start work and how little sleep he required. They often commented that he was superhuman. So, ladies and gentlemen, our super moderator, General Johnson. Sir.
Steve, thanks so much, and I'm doing everything I can to catch up on my sleep now. Steve, thank you and the KDVA team for organizing and getting us together for this webinar. And good evening or good morning, depending on where you are, to everyone in the Republic of Korea and in the United States. I'm very honored to moderate this important topic for KDVA. This webinar follows last month's KDVA webinar series on the 70th commemoration of the start of the Korean War. KDVA recognized our great Korean War veterans with stories from the veterans and their families. Then we held a webinar to talk about carrying on their legacy of the strong ROK-US alliance that they built and fought for. Now our focus is on the United Nations Command and the signing of the Armistice Agreement on July 27, 1953, that halted open warfare on the Korean Peninsula. The United Nations Command is our oldest military command in Korea, but it's also the least understood. In this webinar, we hope to raise everyone's awareness of its mission, its relationship with the Combined Forces Command in the Republic of Korea, and its vital role in maintaining stability in the Korean Peninsula and the region. Joining us today from Hawaii, where it's 2:30 in the morning, is Colonel Shawn Creamer. Shawn has extensive experience working in Korea in the United Nations Command Security Battalion in the Joint Security Area, or Panmunjom, 8th Army, and the ROK-US Combined Joint Task Force 8, and the CFC in the United Nations Command. While an Army War College Fellow at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, he was awarded the 2017 General Matthew B. Ridgway Research Award for his paper about the UNC and the Armistice Agreement. Shawn will take over as the Deputy J5 at USFK later this year. Our two panel members today are former commanders of USFK, CFC, and UNC. General Mike Scaparrotti has recently retired from his 41-year Army career. His last duty position was as Commander, U.S. European Command and Supreme Allied Commander, Europe, NATO. From 2013 to 2016, General Scaparrotti commanded U.S. Forces Korea, United Nations Command, and Combined Forces Command in South Korea. General Scaparrotti has extensive experience leading joint, multinational organizations and collaborating with U.S. interagency and foreign diplomats. He also served as the Director of Operations at U.S. Central Command and as the 69th Commandant of Cadets at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He has commanded forces during Operations Iraqi Freedom, Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, Support Hope in Zaire and Rwanda, Joint Endeavor, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Assured Response in Liberia. He is a senior counsel at the Cohen Group, a member of the board of directors of the Atlantic Council, a member of the advisory board of the Patriot Foundation, a member of the advisory board for the Spirit of America, and a senior fellow at the National Defense University. Joining General Scaparrotti today is General Vince Brooks. General Brooks is a career Army officer who retired from active duty in January 2019. His final tour of duty was from April 2016 to November 2018 as the four-star general in command of over 650,000 Koreans and Americans under arms during a critical time in the Korean Peninsula and in Northeast Asia. He is widely respected as a speaker and recognized as a leader of cohesive, innovative organizations. He's a combat veteran and a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations. General Brooks is vice chairman of the board of directors of the Gary Sinise Foundation, is a director of Diamondback Energy Incorporated, a visiting senior fellow at the Harvard University Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, a distinguished fellow at the University of Texas with both the Clements Center for National Security and also the Strauss Center for International Security and Law, an executive fellow with the Institute for Defense and Business, and the president of VKB Solutions LLC. Both generals are members of KDVA's board of directors. So Shawn, to kick us off this morning, and thank you for joining us so early, we welcome your introduction and a little bit of history about the United Nations Command and the Armistice Agreement.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, everyone. As General Johnson said, I was asked to lead off the panel with a short discussion on the United Nations Command, its origins, how it evolved, and factors which still make it relevant today. It is an honor to offer some words to such a distinguished panel for the Korean Defense Veterans Association. I'll take the next few minutes to briefly frame some of the interesting facets of the command's history and offer some clarity to several little-known aspects on the UNC and its relationship to the United States and the Republic of Korea. To help understand what the UNC is, one has to go back to its beginnings. The UNC was born in the first days and weeks of the Korean War, driven by the American response and international, mostly non-communist outrage over the naked aggression of the North's 25 June 1950 invasion. The United Nations was in its infancy, just 5 years old at this point. The United States and a few other powers were already engaged in combat operations in support of South Korea against the North's forces when the Security Council acted. The United States helped draft UNSCR 84, which bestowed UN legitimacy to a US-led international response. This is a key point that has often been lost over the years due to the command's naming and its use of the UN flag. The United States is the nation responsible for leading the UNC. However, the US is limited in how it can use the command, respecting the legitimacy and mandate of the authorizing UNSCRs. The UNC's connective tissue to the UN and the Security Council are limited but significant. First and foremost, the UN Secretary General and the Security Council bestowed on the US-led command the honor to fly the UN flag during the course of its operations. Second is the UNC reporting on its activities through the US government to the Security Council, which since 1953 has typically been annually. I will not discuss in detail the UNC's role in prosecuting the Korean War, except to convey a few key points which relate to the UNC today. First, the UNC was a belligerent in the war and has served as the vehicle to marshal international military support for the defense of Korea, exercising operational control over and providing support to the multinational combat forces. In conjunction with the passing of Resolution 84 on 7 July 1950, the Korean president placed his armed forces under the control of the UNC for the course of the war. This practice continued after the war as part of the Iraq-US Mutual Defense Treaty until 1978, when UNC transferred its warfighting mission to the bilaterally controlled Combined Forces Command, or CFC. In late July 1950, in response to the significant humanitarian crisis in Korea, the UNC was bestowed by the Security Council through UNSCR 85 as the agency for coordinating international humanitarian support, as it was the only organized body in Korea which could handle the task at the time. As the vehicle for organizing multinational forces, prosecuting the war, and later maintaining friendly compliance to the Armistice Agreement, the US government negotiated several agreements with both South Korea and the Japanese governments on behalf of the multinational forces. The two most important in terms of today were the Meyer Agreement with the Republic of Korea in 1952 and the UN-Japan SOFA of 1954. While the Meyer Agreement was largely economic in nature, one subparagraph provided legal privileges and immunities for the multinational forces to operate in Korea as belligerents. The ambiguous nature of the legal status for sending state forces during crisis or combat is presently a barrier to more active involvement by the sending states and may prevent their timely support in a crisis. The UN-Japan SOFA provides the legal privileges for selected sending state forces to operate in and from Japan. This agreement later served as the legal foundation after 1957, when the UNC moved to Korea, and for Japan to designate UN bases for these UNC forces to operate from. The strategic importance of the UN bases and this SOFA for the rapid deployment of sending state military forces in a crisis has been underappreciated and probably requires additional focus to better posture in Armistice to leverage in a crisis. The Armistice Agreement was intended to serve as a temporary halt to the fighting so that political arrangement could formally end the conflict. The Military Armistice Commission, or MAC, composed of military officers from each side, was designed to carry out reciprocal supervision, observation, inspection, and investigative functions inside the DMZ, maintain a dialogue between the parties, and to conclude agreements to modify the armistice when necessary. The MAC no longer functions as intended, having been supplanted by the UNC Korean People's Army General Officer talks in 1998. The MAC and its replacement serve a valuable purpose as they have allowed military-to-military contact when political avenues remain limited or closed. Most UNC combat forces were withdrawn in 1954. Token forces remained after 1955, with the last sending state forces departing Korea in 1971 and Japan in 1976, leaving only ceremonial forces and the liaison groups. Sending state interest waned in the 1970s, with more than half ceasing active involvement, but with most returning in the 1990s and early 2000s. The US, recognizing that times were changing, conducted a study in 1965, which explored alternative pathways for the UNC and the US security relationship with the Republic of Korea. The decade of 1968 to 1978 observed the most significant change in the ROC-US alliance and its relationship to the UNC. From the establishment of the bilateral operational planning staff in 1966, the formation of the Security Consultative Meeting Body in 1968, the formation of the First Corps ROC-US Group in 1971, what was an integrated field army headquarters, and the creation of the US-Korean battle staff concept and the fusion of the Korean ULCHI and UNC focus lens exercises in 1975, followed by the creation of the Military Committee in 1977, all set in motion the formation of the CFC in 1978. All of this was done on UNC's watch with their, collaboratively with their Korean partners. When CFC arrived on the scene, the UNC was deliberately placed into the background. The UNC continued its armistice maintenance functions, maintained the UN-Japan SOFA, and was available to resume its role as the active vehicle for multinational integration to defend Korea should hostilities resume. UNC has faced some challenges over the last 4 decades after it transferred the warfighter role to CFC. The first challenge is UNC's use of other commands' manpower in a double or triple-headed fashion, where UNC duties became more ceremonial than actual. The lack of dedicated manpower led to a loss in institutional knowledge in what the UNC is and what it can or should do. Virtually every UNC commander since 1978 observed this problem, with incremental changes occurring over time. The second challenge, exacerbated by the previous point, is one of identity, with UNC and its role not properly appreciated nor integrated into the overall international and bilateral alliance defense construct. The dichotomy of UNC is the International Military Command, which is, in effect, in support of a bilateral military alliance, is not lost on many of our sending state partners. Absent a concerted effort by both Korea and the US to court sending state involvement, will limit the utility of the UNC to leverage the latent military power of the sending states in crisis or in a resumption of hostilities. For if anything, North Korea has proven itself with its decades of extremely violent behavior, including its many unambiguous attacks on both the US and Korea, to be remarkably astute at operating inside the decisions trade space of the US and South Korea. However, at some point, North Korea could misjudge and overplay its hand, as they did on June 25th, 1950, with possibly disastrous results leading to a chain of events that cannot be de-escalated. And that is where the effort to make UNC an active, integrated partner will pay off. Thank you, sir.
Shawn, that was great and easy to see why you've been asked to come back to USFK as the Deputy J5. Thanks for that this morning, setting the conditions for this discussion. So we'll get our discussion started with opening remarks from General Scaparrotti. Sir, thank you, and please take the mic.
Thank you, JD. And it's an honor to be here, particularly with JD, Vince, Shawn Creamer, Steve, again, to talk about this important topic. I think JD, and once again, thank KDVA for putting this on. I'll start with, just kind of a review of how I viewed the UN command as I came in initially and taking command. And it resonates with what Shawn Creamer just laid out. As I looked at it and the commanders before me, it was somewhat in the background. All of its positions were dual-hatted. It was essentially the third of the three commands that, while being manned predominantly by US personnel, was basically the third in order of their duties. But in short order, I began to realize, as Shawn said, the power of these 18 nations. Not only military, but I'm talking about their ability to influence through economic, diplomatic, informational powers. And secondly, they were very interested. Many of the ambassadors of the sending states provided good advice, were very interested. And over time, I decided it was probably time to begin a revitalization, as we called it during that time, of the UN command. We wrote a white paper. We began to talk with those sending nations ambassadors and the Republic of Korea about what it was and what it was not, importantly, and then laid out a plan to, quote, revitalize the UN command. Began meetings of the ambassadors on a regular basis, a meeting of the command. We began to populate the command so that it wouldn't be dual-hatted. They'd actually have key positions filled with officers, international officers that could execute the duties of the UN command. So we just basically started that revitalization. Vince picked it up and took that vision a great deal further, and I commend him for the work that he and his staff did in filling that out. And I think I'll just stop there and let it go to questions as the real vitalization of the UN took place under Vince's command.
Thank you, General Scaparrotti. General Brooks.
Well, good evening and good morning to everybody, and especially it's a great delight to be with such great friends and colleagues that I've known for so many years on this panel. My thanks, as always, to KDVA, Korea Defense Veterans Association, for arranging this webinar and several others as well. These have been excellent webinars, and coming to KDVA is a great place to get information if you really want to understand the situation in Korea and hear it from those who actually lived it. I appreciate the comments by Shawn Creamer and by Scap on what came before. And it's really important to understand that we really can't operate in Korea without an understanding of history. And that's been really well laid out. And I thank both of my colleagues for laying it out so well. You know, in many ways, each one of the commanders coming into command, as Shawn mentioned, have had to recognize some of the limitations, shortfalls, and challenges associated with UN command, the oldest of the three commands, but in many ways, as has been described, the least understood, but in some ways, perhaps the most important. And we saw that emerge in the period of 2016 to 18 while I was in command. Without a doubt, we were picking up on General Mike Scaparrotti's vision and his initial efforts to, as we did call it then, revitalize, to bring back to greater life the United Nations Command and its role. And indeed, as time went on with the significant missile and nuclear activity that happened in 2016 and 17, it was evident to me as the commander of UN Command and the other two commands that we had to really understand the difference between one command and another, what the authorities were, what the reporting chains were, and each is different. I won't go into that in detail, but especially the important role of trying to preserve an armistice, which today is 67 years old. And it's an interesting day for us to do this, given the critically important role of UN Command in preserving that armistice for these 67 years. I know that General Abrams just spoke up in Panmunjom just a few hours ago. And one of the comments that he made, as I understand it, is that really nothing contributes more to the security of South Korea than the will of the international community to implement the armistice. And that has been an unchanged fact for now the past 67 years. Great and important point. It's the armistice that has prevented a resumption of open war. And there have been some close calls. As Shawn talked about that period in the late 1960s and leading up to 78, but especially from 66 to 1969, where there was open warfare again, limited in scale, but some call it the Second Korean War. The UN Command has conducted operations through the years to try to respond to different things that have emerged in the conditions of armistice, but the objective has always been to restore a cessation of hostilities until a lasting peace agreement can be arranged. That, ladies and gentlemen, is really the thing we've all been waiting for. General Mark Clark, as he signed the armistice, expressed his dissatisfaction that we shouldn't be happy about what's happening because the objective was peace, and that objective has not been fulfilled, still hasn't been fulfilled. 67 years of armistice preservation. So just a couple of thoughts about UN Command as we embraced it. And we saw that there was going to be an increasing role for UN Command with its unique authorities. First, to prevent the resumption of hostilities. That was always the objective for UN Command, and it was the day-to-day activity, whether it was ensuring that the two sides, North Korea and the UN Command, more specifically South Korean forces and US forces, were in compliance with the armistice agreement. And we did that with the help of a great group of countries, the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission. I want to shout out to them. I know a few of the veterans of those Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission experiences are on the net with us today, and I appreciate them being with us. But the countries of Sweden, Switzerland, and initially Poland and Czechoslovakia, those four countries were really supposed to ensure that the two sides were living up to their agreement. And so with this collective body, we worked on trying to preserve that armistice. But it was clear that as the situation with North Korea was changing, a greater role for UN Command might be called beyond the preservation of the armistice. First, the UN Command can enable dialogue by granting access, by allowing crossings, as the armistice agreement has specified. The authority to allow any crossings of the military demarcation line between North and South Korea belongs to the Military Armistice Commission. And in the South, that's administered by United Nations Command. So it enabled dialogue, and indeed that became critically important. And as Shawn Creamer has highlighted, it also was and still is the home for international commitments. When a third country other than the United States and South Korea commit capability, whether it is for peace, yet to be fulfilled, or whether it's for war, long prevented, then that place for them is UN Command. And this is particularly important since 1978, with the establishment of the Republic of Korea US Combined Forces Command. That's a binational command. It's an alliance command. Other countries are not part of that alliance. It is the warfighting command now, as UN Command was in 1950 to 1953. But now it's Combined Forces Command. And UN Command provides support to it in the form of international commitments and international legitimacy if something were to resume. And the ideal outcome, of course, would be peace emerges. And there may be a role for military forces in creating and enforcing peace, just as there was a role for military forces in the Military Armistice Commission to establish the conditions of armistice so many years ago. And that's important to understand. The relationship with North Korea is fundamentally a military relationship. The document that has governed the interactions for these 67 years is a military document. And the role of a military command in helping to break that down, to go from armistice to peace, which requires many steps, called for some command to still be able to do that. And that was United Nations Command. And so these three roles, preserving the armistice, enabling dialogue, and providing a home for international commitments, has been our focus ever since. And there were vital roles, and I know we'll talk about that as we get into this. So I'll stop right here with those words of introduction. And thanks, JD, back over to you.
Thanks, General Brooks. So we're going to open it up to questions. And our first question, I think, is one of the ones that I hear most often when it comes to the role of UNC. And that is, what's the command relationship between UNC and the future combined command once the ROC assumes the lead, once we go through operational control transition? And so let's start with General Scaparrotti, please.
Well, I think Vince has probably dealt with this more recently, but my view of that would be that, again, as he said, it's a supporting role. Essentially, the future command is very much like CFC at this point, but with the roles reversed, as the commander being a ROC 4-star. But UNC, as Vince said, has always been a powerful supporter, in my view, and would continue to be in that role, and also a role of the three roles that he noted before, particularly maintaining the armistice until such time that a peace agreement is made and we move forward from that aspect. And I'll go to Vince now.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a supporting relationship right now. It was the parent, okay? So CFC emerged from the tree trunk of United Nations Command, but the relationship now is a supporting relationship. In military parlance, that's well understood. Supporting and supported relationships. It depends on the activity that's ongoing. Those can reverse. So when it comes to preserving the armistice, UN Command is supported by the South Korean Armed Forces and the US Armed Forces and the Neutral Nations Supervisory Commission. But when it comes to conditions of war or transitioning to the conditions of peace, which may require disarmament actions, relocation actions, remarking actions, all those sorts of things, then UN Command provides the support, and it's to Combined Forces Command. So I think that's an important piece to understand. The transfer of operational control of forces in wartime, that's the full expression of OPCON transfer, of control of forces in wartime, that relationship remains exactly the same. So the future Combined Forces Command and the future UN Command, if there is not yet peace, remains exactly the same. CFC remains a binational command, present and future. It will be led by a different country's general, but it remains a binational command with the structures that Shawn Creamer talked about, the security consultation mechanism, the military committee meeting, these binational structures that decide what actions the combined command is to take. UN Command will still provide support to it and be in relationship with it for as long as there's not peace.
Thank you, General Brooks, both of you. You know, there are those that talk about potential tensions as we go through this transition between UNC and the ROC-led CFC. Could you address those tensions and why there should not be concerns because of this, the role of UNC? You start with General Brooks.
Well, sure. Throw out a couple of comments on that. There are some tensions. There has always been the tension of absolute sovereignty versus limitations on sovereignty, like the imposition of an armistice, which initially was not agreed to by South Korea, although there was a very important representative on that armistice negotiating team. General Peck's son Yup, who we just honored last week after he passed. But the sense that UN command somehow impedes sovereignty is an underlying concern. In my analysis, and certainly in my practice, and I know SCAP's practice as well, we did everything we could to make sure we weren't infringing on sovereignty and yet fulfilling our responsibilities. And I think that's the case still, but that has to be understood that there's a political concern about sovereignty. There's also the international aspect of UN command. Who is part of it? We talked about the 16 to 18 countries that actually provided forces during the war and the additional supporting countries, a total of 22 when it's all said and done for sending and supporting. Are they the same ones if something were to happen now? So the composition of UN command in a future need is a point of friction. Where do they base? Who decides that? Shawn alluded to the need for bilateral agreements for visitations of forces. They should come in exercises if they're interested. They should participate in key events. And certainly if we're on the field doing the actual job, whatever it is, peace or war, they need to have a presence and be supported in South Korea and also in Japan, which initially was viewed as a rear area, but cannot be viewed that way now. Japan is likely a front area, given the capabilities that North Korea faces. And striding the East Sea, Sea of Japan, is United Nations Command, which has relationships in both. There's some tension there as to the South Korea-Japan relationship and UN Command's relationship with each of them. These are just some examples, and I'll turn it over to Scap.
Vince, I think you hit it correctly. I mean, the major one was a concern about sovereignty. As I started the revitalization, as I told you, I shared the white paper we were writing in draft with the Republic of Korea leaders for that very reason, because I wanted them and I wanted to understand their concerns so that we could mitigate those and reduce those as we develop this revitalization. The first of theirs was sovereignty. I think the second, there's one that's just change is difficult in complex organizations, and particularly one where it's with CFC being a U.S. ROC command, the lead, so to speak, there, and concerns that there might be disruption in that relationship as a result of bringing in ascending nations and reinforcing or at least revitalizing their activity as a part of the activities there on the peninsula. And so we had to reduce their concerns about that. They were concerned about the influence of the UN command bases in Japan as well. In fact, we established a routine trip of officers to the UN command bases in Japan for the Republic of Korea officers in order to introduce them to what these bases were, how they were important, and how they would be helpful in the future with respect to both maintaining the armistice, but also if conflict should occur. So those were steps that we took to address the normal concerns that one would expect when you begin a change in relationship and a revitalization of a command that had largely been just focused on very specific military tasks to that point.
You know, Shawn did a great job, and both of you have talked about the evolving nature of these commands and their relationships. General Scaparrotti, you're the only UNC, CFC, USFK commander who also served as a SAC-UR and the USUCOM commander. Could you talk a little bit about the commonalities or differences in those two commands and what you learned as a SAC-UR that might apply to this discussion for the future of Korea commands?
Yeah, thanks, JD. Well, you know, first of all, I tell people that my experience in Korea was a great experience to prepare me to be the SAC-UR, because you went from a very great, well-established alliance with very good processes between the nations, between the ROC and the U.S., into one of then 28 nations, now 30. SAC-UR and NATO is much more complex simply because of the number of nations, for instance. But I found in Korea, the establishment of that alliance, its processes and its working was very relevant in that both those alliances were looking at a deterrence action, deterring different adversaries or challengers, but same deterrence in the 21st century. And there was a lot of commonality there in how you approach that. Secondly, the diplomatic portion of that as a commander. In line of the UNC functions, and then also the Republic of Korea and the regional functions, there's a lot of diplomatic interface for the UNC commander. And that is true, obviously, in NATO as well. And so the skills there, and also the processes that I saw and we developed as well with UNC as we revitalized, were important to me as I went into to be the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe as well. And so it was, I think, both instructional for me, but also gave a good basis. I took some of the processes, et cetera, and the way that we had developed on the Korean Peninsula to NATO to help improve their viewpoint and their processes.
Thanks, General Scaparrotti. General Brooks, a question for you from the participants. Would an end of war declaration, either inter-Korean or involving the U.S., create political or diplomatic pressure to end the UNC?
Well, yes, it will. It creates a new dynamic. Some may assume that an end of war declaration equals an end of UN command. I think that that's a shallow thought. It might, but I don't believe that's a simultaneous event, that with declaration of end of hostilities or declaration of peace, that suddenly UN command ends. I've already mentioned the important roles of some organization, ideally a multinational organization, engaging in the actions that create the conditions of peace. In 2018, we engaged in dialogue with the South Korean armed forces, who were in direct communication with the North Korean People's Army, on trying to find ways to diffuse tension, to make room for dialogue to reemerge, as we saw some changes, perhaps the effect of deterrence in 2017, but nevertheless a change that occurred at the beginning of 2018 and opened the door to a season of symmetry. But among those diplomatic actions were also military actions to lower tension, and it resulted in the comprehensive military agreement that is still in effect, that has added to the quality of the armistice. Distances are now greater than the initially established armistice. No-fly areas are larger than they were and further from the opposing side, so that there's less chance of an accident. Some of the guard posts have been demilitarized, so especially the ones that were in close proximity, less than 1 kilometer, where incidents could easily happen. And even in Panmunjom, which had become well known as the standoff area, physically standing off just feet away from one another. Many of the military conditions inside of there have been reduced. So there's going to be some tension in this recognition of, well, we've got peace now. Didn't you say that's what the armistice was awaiting and what UN command was waiting? And that's true. But the role of establishing peace includes significant military activity. And someone has to be deputized with doing that. And of course, that would be the belligerents themselves, if you want to use that original term. So the North Korean People's Army, South Korean Armed Forces, which is nearly the entirety of the line of defense, and the US forces that remain present there as well. There would have to be some military adjustments that come with that. It's not instantaneous. So Vince Brooks's opinion is the role of UN command remains one about introducing conditions of peace. And at some point in time, it could be disestablished, but that should be a very deliberate decision. Again, in my opinion, it would be at least among the 3 countries involved, perhaps even China, which was an original signatory to the document. And it might need to go back to the United Nations Security Council, carried in by the United States. I used the metaphor of birth mother who gives up the child for adoption very quickly after birth, and the child is raised by another mother for a period of time. And then both of them have gotten old, and so has the child. The child is now 70 years old, and that's UN command. But the relationship may still need to go back to its origins in order to stand it down. So these are considerations that ought to be opened now and into the future as the potential of peace is out there. We ought to have a plan internationally on how that's going to be done. And I would submit to you that that's lacking at the present time.
As you know, there's some press tuned in today, and we have a question from the press. The Rock media has expressed suspicion that the U.S. is eager to shift UNC's traditional role to a broader engagement vehicle now that there is so much U.S. focus on Indo-Pacific strategy, and that after OPCON transfer, there are suspicions that the nature of UNC would have a broader Indo-Pacific role. We start with General Brooks. I ask you to address that, please.
I'll be very brief. I don't think so. I don't think those two are related. Okay, the international community committed to action for the Korean Peninsula and the conditions there. That's UN Command's mandate. To change the mandate would mean to go back to the UN Security Council. And while that is possible, it's very improbable. So I don't believe that they're related. The Indo-Pacific strategy is a US-led strategy that involves other countries, and relationships will emerge for that strategy separate from UN Command. It may have been enabled by some of the relationships that existed in UN Command with some of the key players that have stayed with the team the whole time, but it's not the same.
Thank you. Shifting slightly, there's a lot of skepticism of the role of the United Nations among South Koreans. We've just talked about part of that. How do you address the concern that the UNC does far more to constrain South Korea than North Korea, and how it maintains the armistice? And we'll start with General Scaparrotti, please.
Well, I think first of all, part of this was the revitalization with Vince in particular in his time period, talking about UNC, its role, and how it plays in these, in the daily activities. I think it's a matter of information that is helpful in that. From a ROC viewpoint at times, because of also the role of the military committee, et cetera, in investigating any conflict or problems along the DMZ, it was often looked at that way, particularly within Iraq military. But that was a very specific and finite part of its mission, and part of our reason for the revitalization and beginning to talk about UNC is the capacity it has to do much more. Going back to the other questions, I would just say that, one of the things I learned in NATO as well, but I knew in Korea, is while, multinational organizations like this, like the UNC or alliances, are complex because of many nations taking part in it. My observation is in the process of leveraging those nations, you generally get a better outcome, whether it's planning, et cetera. And so what they bring to bear in support of peace and setting conditions for peace, et cetera, within the peninsula, I think are very important and shouldn't be overlooked.
Yeah, JD, can I jump on that and
Please.
join Scap's comment? I think Scap
Please
is
do.
right on target there. That international role of being able to pursue peace is a critically important role. And UN Command is an enabler to that. So I picked up the monthly roundtables with the UN sending state ambassadors and supporting state ambassadors that you had in place and that your predecessors also had, but it was particularly alive during your time, and we built on that. And that became a very important venue for those countries to have a perspective of the military conditions on the peninsula. The meetings are convened by the UN commander. So it's a military commander requesting the ambassadors of those countries that were sending states or supporting states to come and join in conference every single month. And update is provided to them about how UN Command sees the situation and what it looks like from a military perspective. I can tell you that was a really important, truly vital role that UN Command played during the uncertain times of 2017. And indeed, it had some of the originating effect of the Vancouver dialogue, which occurred in the early winter months of 2018, February 2018, late January to February 2018. That was reflective of the same kind of dialogue. So this international dialogue that says both, hey, North Korea, you got to knock it off. You're getting our attention. And also the importance of the international community emphasizing the preservation of armistice and achieving conditions of peace. Both of these are very important, and they were enabled by United Nations Command. Let me make one last comment here, JD, about this sense of tension and whether UN Command is a constrainer or an enabler. I would submit to you that the season of summitry that really opened in 2018 and carried into 2019 was absolutely enabled by UN Command. The authorization first to conduct non-public meetings, quiet meetings that opened the channels of dialogue. It was US and North Korea, South Korea and North Korea. UN Command said yes to those things to enable that, to enable dialogue to occur. It ultimately became exchanges of large delegations, exchanges of Olympic team members. The Olympics themselves emerged. I'm not suggesting UN Command is responsible for the Olympics, but I am suggesting that UN Command was an enabler to the Olympics and to the summits, even down to the physical conditions that happened in Panmunjom for the very first summit between President Moon Jae-in and leader Kim Jong-un. The physical things that had to be done there were enabled by UN Command in partnership with the Republic of Korea and the South Korean government. So this is an important relationship. It's an enabler. It has succeeded in enabling multiple times, and it can make a difference as we try to move forward.
In your most recent comments, you've addressed one of our other questions. So just to get it on the table and see if General Scaparrotti has anything else to add to it. There have been a lot of discussion in the Republic of Korea, to include by Republic of Korean officials and administrators, that the UNC is in fact an obstacle to inter-Korean relationships. So you've just spoken of the way that UNC facilitated the era of summitries you talked about. General Scap, anything to add to that?
No, I would just say, I think Vince has some very current and insightful stories about how the UNC helped. But even in the time that I was the commander, and we had conflicts in the Northern Limit Line, or particularly the box mine incident, August of 15, and the exchange of fire, the information provided to the UNC nations, as well as their messaging, etc., was helpful to the Republic of Korea in maintaining stability and keeping what could have very easily become a greater conflict from becoming one. And I think they also internationally played a role in that through their messaging that assisted indirectly in the ROC's negotiations that came out positively from that negotiation as a result of that incident. All that time, the ambassadors in those nations were in support of maintaining stability along the DMZ and the security of the Republic of Korea simultaneously.
Picking up on that, there's a perception that the U.S. is stepping back on the international stage and assuming more of a transactional role in its partnerships. What do you think about the role of UNC? Is that to be affected by this perception, or do you see the role of the UNC and the U.S.'s commitment to it remaining consistent?
Well, I think I see it remaining consistent. The UN Command was established as a U.S. lead by the UNSCR, et cetera. And so we've got a responsibility there, and I think we'll maintain that responsibility. Personally, I think that I think that our leadership in multinational institutions and alliances like NATO, like UNC, et cetera, is vital. Nations respond to our leadership. They expect our leadership, and it's important that we maintain that leadership as well.
Thank you. This next question, I'll start with General Brooks, and then come back to General Scaparrotti. You know, we've talked a lot about the nature of UNC, but you too have sat in the seat in some of the most trying times. And the question has to do with, what was your most challenging time? And could you give some insights as to the role of UNC as a result of that challenge? And then, is there something that still keeps you up at night as you're watching the situation and thinking back on your time as the UNC commander? We'll start with General Brooks.
Well, let me see if I can retrieve 3 examples, and if time permits, I'll be quick about it. General Scapp will remember as he was leaving command, we saw an increase in Chinese fishing boats coming into the area called the Han River Estuary. This is on the west coast of the Korean Peninsula, where the Han River meets the West Sea or Yellow Sea. And it happens to also be where these islands that General Scaparrotti was just talking about, that had had incidents of great tension, naval battles, losses of life, direct combat action, artillery strikes. All these things have happened in Armistice within the last 10 years. And these fishing boats were coming right down through the middle of it and going into an area that neither North Korea nor South Korea is allowed to administer. The Military Armistice Commission administers the Han River Estuary. It's written right into the Armistice Agreement. And while civil traffic is allowed to occur close to the coastlines of each side, fishing is not allowed. Well, the Chinese fishing vessels figured out that they had essentially a wildlife preserve there, and they began to harvest it in close range of both North Korean and South Korean forces, and it created great frustration. So I'll cut to the end of the story here. UN Command, working in close partnership with the South Korean Joint Chiefs of Staff and Ministry of Defense, created a maritime police force that didn't previously exist. We knew about the military police force wearing brassards that operate in Panmunjom and along the DMZ, but not at sea. And so that was created. The UN flag was flying over the South Korean flag. The rules of engagement were created and designed by UN Command, and it was the first UN operation conducted since 1976, Operation Paul Bunyan. So I remember that. I remember the tensions that were associated with that, and recognizing the sovereignty concerns as we designed that force, but we did so in partnership. A second one perhaps would be when we had incidents that did happen in the demilitarized zone, like the very visible crossing by a North Korean soldier in November of 2017, driving a vehicle down that one road that leads into the truce village of Panmunjom on the north side, trying to drive the vehicle straight across the military demarcation line. There's a small trench there, which his tire caught. He jumped out of his vehicle, being chased by his fellow countrymen who had weapons we didn't know they had inside of that truce village, rifles, as well as pistols, shooting at him and hitting him 5 to 7 times. Well, there was some tension over how the response to that was to occur. And ultimately it came down to UN Command and the United Nations Command Joint Security Battalion, which is Korean and Americans together living there in Panmunjom under one command, responding with great restraint and great discipline because they weren't fired on. But the North Korean soldier was and was hit. That was a second one that we had to work through. And it reaffirmed the important role of UN Command in working through this and in fact, diffusing tension, as there was some political call in South Korea for an armed response. But it wasn't South Korean forces that had been fired upon. And so restraint was applied more carefully in that case, and it helped to open the doors to the things that came in 2018. The final one, the third one, would be the creation of this comprehensive military agreement. And there was some tension where the US government was concerned about anything that would release the important pressure that had been applied to North Korea and that South Korea, yearning for peace, might end up moving too quickly. And so trying to maintain the dialogue with North Korea, South Korea, and the US government became one of the roles of United Nations Command. And taking the appropriate risk to lower the tension and create room for dialogue is what UN Command did. And that worked a little bit against the US forces role in that, which was impacted in some of its training until mitigated, and the combined forces role, which would have to defend the Republic. So each one of those had a different view of the Comprehensive Military Agreement. UN Command was the one that led the effort to establish the Comprehensive Military Agreement, even with some friction from the US government. So that's how I would comment on that.
Thank you very much, General Scaparrotti. Some insights from you.
Yeah, I think the major one for me that I noted was August 15. If you remember, during that time period, there had been other small crises along the DMZ or the Northern Limit Line, but then we had the box mine attack that severely wounded 2 ROC NCOs on patrol, mines that were placed specifically to wound those out on one of their patrol routes along the DMZ. And then shortly after that, while we were in our August exercise, the exchange of fire along the DMZ occurred. And so you had the tension of the first one, and then the buildup, and that incident of exchange of fire that brought both forces really along the DMZ to the highest state of alert they'd been in since the mid-90s. And it was a very, very tense time. Of course, there were calls for immediate response from the Republic of Korea military. And I think in this case, the UN command, having that separate role of maintaining the armistice, looking and observing at what occurred, looking into that quickly, being able to come up and provide a viewpoint objectively in those couple of days of high tension was very important to providing information, for instance, to the Republic of Korea that they used wisely, and I think very prudently, as they worked their way through a very tough negotiation over 2 days, almost nonstop. But it was some of that information that I think informed them as to how they would approach that negotiation and bring it to the fruitful end and peaceful end that they did.
Thanks, General Scaparrotti. So we're winding down, and I want to give each of you a minute for any closing comments, but I have to throw out this last question. It may be a way that you can fold it into your comments. There's some, I think, misunderstanding in some cases about South Korean or ROC elements within UNC and what role they either play or could play. So let me give the first chance for final comments to General Brooks.
Well, JD, thanks for doing this once again. My last comments I'll address your question and close with just a few very quick points. The South Koreans play a critical role inside of UN Command. Some of the key general officer staff positions are held by South Koreans. As part of this effort to make the role of UN Command more vital, to bring it more to life, we wanted to balance that a bit more because UN Command and Combined Forces Command began to look too much alike, where they were Americans and South Koreans. And so we sought to increase the number of other country contributions to the staff roles. And most notable was Canada committing a 3-star general who is now the Chief of the Army, General Wayne Eyre, to be the first non-American, non-Korean deputy commander of UN Command, a very important step. And so some of the ROC US characteristics of UN Command were deliberately reduced so that those two could concentrate on the Combined Forces Command, and so that the international community had a greater role in what was to follow. So I'll leave my response to your question at that. Let me just close by saying I think that UN Command is a very important command. It has been, it still is, and it will be into the future. It provides a basis upon which change can occur. I think change is coming to the peninsula, and ideally that's not a change that resorts back to war. It's a change that ultimately leads to peace. We need someone who has been fighting for peace for these many years, 70 years really, not just 67, to play a role in that. And so I strongly encourage the role of UN Command being thoroughly thought through as part of the basis upon which change can occur. But thanks again for the privilege of joining you today.
Thank you, General Brooks. General Scott.
Well, to the first question, JD, I would just say that, you know, the ROC presence in the UNC was very important, as Vince pointed out. But for me, in the initial stages, it was because I wanted to ensure that we could establish and maintain trust. I mean, their insight and a part of this organization, they were present at the meetings with the ambassadors, et cetera, that we held every month. They were a part of all the staff actions. That provided them insight and ability to question and establish the trust that you've got to have inside of any alliance, and you need to have in any organization like UNC. So to me, their role is vital, and it allays those fears that we talked about earlier here in the program, in my view. By way of closing, I would just echo what Vince said, and that is that I think UNC is vital to the present and to the future resolution of the conflict here in the peninsula. I'm a firm believer in the power of an international organization working together, and I think in today's world, with the connectivity, the global connectivity, the influence, the speed of influence on humans, that it's actually this international component in the UNC is vital to us finding a way to bring this to a peaceful resolution as opposed to one of conflict.
Thanks, General Brooks, General Scaparrotti, and Shawn, for your very insightful comments. Every time I'm around any of you, I learn a lot about the nature of this alliance and the nature today of UNC. Very instructive. I look forward to future conversations. Just one last note as we prepare to leave. On July 10th, 2020, the ROC-US Alliance lost its greatest champion and mentor, General and Ambassador Peckham Sung-Yup. KDVA held a tribute webinar on July 17th to ensure that General Beck's unmatched efforts for the Alliance would not be forgotten. We're very fortunate today to have Ms. Namhee Park, General Beck's daughter, as one of the attendees for the webinar. Our condolences go out to you and the rest of your family. And thank you so much for continuing to be a part of the dialogue that makes the ROC-US Alliance the strength that it is. Thanks for everyone for attending. We will get word out well in advance of future webinars. We appreciate your participation today and the great questions that you had. So thank you very much. Goodbye.